legislation. Right?
Lawfare, like warfare, only lawfare.
And so here's it, right, because everything has to be litigated. So first of all, when you have to litigate things like that, the legislation is void for vagueness. So the law has to be clear, and especially when we're talking about criminal law, a man ought to know what a man ought not do. But you go read these laws and you're like, I don't even know what they're talking about. On top of the fact that there's mounds and mounds of this pretended legislation. So what the legal profession is doing through the legislative houses is they're creating torts. This is exactly the same thing as a business introducing a new product line. You make something illegal, or you have some legislation, like for example, I'll give you an example out of California. They have a 5-hour meal break law in California. If the employee doesn't take a meal break within 5 hours, then not only the meal break would be for a half hour, but the employer has to pay them for a full hour. It's one of the most, it has caused more litigation in the state of California because, and I can tell you, employees weren't complaining about being hungry in 5 hours. This was Billy Bob attorney with Joe Bob legislator getting together saying, how can we make more money? And so they legislate like that and say, employees have to have a meal break. And then they go around and the attorneys put flyers on under windshield wipers. And they say, hey, did you not get your meal break in 5 hours? And pretty soon you get a disgruntled employee that got fired, and they take that flyer and they go sue the employer. So what they're doing is basically it's introducing a new product line, a new revenue stream for the legal profession. And so this is an incredible problem that we have in the Tennessee legislature. Now, to understand that, you pretty much have to be an attorney, to understand how to decipher through all of this. Well, I am a lawyer. I'm not an attorney. I'm not a licensed attorney, but as a forensic accountant, I am an expert at reading through the fine print and finding out and saying, this is why and this is where this legislation is corrupt. And so I get in office, I'm going to expose that corruption. I expose it as a citizen, but I'm going to put it in their face in committee hearings and say, here's what's going on, my fellow colleagues, and are we going to put up with this? And I got about 5 minutes left, and I really want to get through a lot of this. Unfortunately, it's so fascinating that it's probably worth 2 episodes if you're willing to come back sometime. But in the meantime, most of the things right now in the news that President Trump is now being indicted for the 4th time or 100th count or whatever it is, used to be just normal politics, the way I read it. Everything from asking for a phone number to whatever. Do you think Governor Lee has engaged in any of the same stuff Trump is being prosecuted for and should be on the lookout? No, I don't think Lee has engaged in anything that where he's going to be prosecuted for. But Rhino Lee, he's a liar. We look at his 10 for 10. When he was campaigning back in his first election, one of those was term limits. We haven't heard a thing out of him about term limits. He's a liar, and he's a rhino. He's in the pocket of the entrenched establishment. I think Lee is probably a pretty good guy. But he is out of his depth. He doesn't understand. He's just listening to lying attorneys. As an example, he appointed a former judge from the Court of Appeals and the Board of Judicial Conduct. I'm telling you, if you're appointing a former Board of Judicial Conduct judge, you're being influenced. I can guarantee you, Lee didn't know that judge. Somebody just told him it'd be a good idea to take this corrupt judge. It's his number one person in his cabinet. It's his number one chief of cabinet that he appointed as corrupt. So I think Lee is just a lackey for the corrupt establishment. I think he's in way over his head and doesn't have a clue. He doesn't understand the corruption, the way that I do. Now, when we talk,
how did the Tennessee GOP support you last time?
Well, they put him on the party ticket.
No, when you were running, how did they support you?
Well, the GOP despises me because I exposed the corruption, and they won't give me any support. And just like they did to Curtis Carney, I'm quite certain that they would remove me from the Republican Party ticket And then because of statutory law, then you're off the ballot completely. It's why I run as an independent. But I have, conservatives like Brandon Lewis, Tennessee conservative. He stood up and said, I'm voting for John Gentry, So there are, conservatives that are standing up for me. The GOP, they don't like me and I don't like them.
How would you run differently next time?
I'm going to do this. I'm going to do the same thing that I did before. I'm not going to run differently. I've been thinking long and hard. I'm running for state house right now. And, I'm sure I would win if I ran as a Republican. But I don't know that I'm not going to get kicked off the ballot. But, George Washington, please go back and read his farewell address. He said, let me give you the most solemn warning of party affiliation. He said, it's going to cause false alarms like the pandemic. It's going to cause division, at times insurrection and riots. So everything that is happening today, George Washington warned us about in his farewell address. And so I'm not going to run on the party ticket just so I can win. It's against my moral standards. And so I'm going to run as an independent candidate.
In Article 11, it is extremely difficult to amend our state constitution, which is why ours has remained mostly intact, like we talked about. The last election, there were 4 amendments to the Constitution. Did you like how that went down? Was that the voice of the people?
No, that is absolutely unconstitutional and repugnant to the Tennessee Constitution. Here's why. In Article 11, I believe it's Section 3, is how our Constitution used to be amended. Prior to 1953, there were 6 attempts to amend our Constitution. They all failed. In 1953, they suckered the people into a constitutional convention, and they changed how the Constitution is amended. And what happens now, the new process from 1953, is that one General Assembly can recommend and approve an amendment to the Constitution, but it has to go to a second General Assembly. Now, here's what they did that was smart, is they said before it goes 6 months before the election of the second General Assembly, it has to be published. And what does published mean? It means Black's Law Dictionary, to make known to the public in general. And those 4 amendments were not made public to the people 6 months prior to the election. They were not made public at all. I stood in line in Sumner County, and they're handing out pieces of paper saying, here are the constitutional amendments. And people are reading like, what is this? I didn't even know about this. The people in general did not know because they were not published. And I went back and read the 1870 Constitutional Convention Proceedings and Debates. And in 1870, they recommended that it be published in 2 newspapers in every major city, as well as 1 newspaper in every county. And that lost by a 3% margin. And so what they did is they wanted to print 75,000 copies. And they said no. And then they said 50,000 copies, and they agreed on it. They printed 50,000 copies of the Constitution that were distributed to the members of the House to take back to their constituents so they could read whether or not to vote in favor or against the 1870 Tennessee Constitution. They don't do that. And let me tell you the other trick.
Okay, wait, I only have time for one more question. I really want to get it out there. So our Tennessee General Assembly has an average proposal of 1,500 bills, and they pass about 1,000 pieces of legislation every year, year over year. That's a lot of laws for a state that did pretty well without new ones for 227 years. Would you as governor want to stop that? And does the governor have the power to stop that? And then they got to let you go.
Absolutely. So I'm running for Tennessee House right now, but as governor, I would veto every single piece of legislation that looked corrupt to me, which is 99% of it. I would veto it. They have to reconvene to pass that. I would create a bottleneck for them because they would have to keep coming back and voting for everything that they just passed before. On top of that, I would go out to the people and say, here's why I vetoed this. And I want you to call your senator, call your representative, and tell them not to override Gentry's veto. And I will shut down at least 50% of that garbage pretended legislation coming out of those corrupt houses.
Awesome. All right. Well, we are at the end here, so tell everyone where they can go to find out more about you, any of your social media, any of your upcoming speaking engagements, websites, anything you want to tell them, shoot.
Sure. Well, easiest way, just Google John Gentry, Tennessee, and you'll find me. My website's We the People, V as in Victor, 50, We the People, V50.com. And if you look for John Gentry on Facebook, I write a lot of essays. I expose a lot of the corruption in essays and articles that I put on my Facebook page, as well as I do a lot of educational video work on my Facebook page. And my YouTube channel, you can witness me fighting in the courts, fighting in the legislative houses, and you can understand my passion and my commitment to this fight, and you'll know that I'm real.
Certainly have all of that. I live across the street, or at least a stone's throw away from Gentry Farms. Any relation?
Well, my fifth great grandfather, Jesse Gentry, was a Tennessee pioneer. His father, Robert Gentry, was a Tennessee pioneer. The Gentrys were one of the first to settle in East Tennessee, and so there's a lot of Gentrys in Tennessee, and I expect that I'm not personally, closely related, but that's why there are a lot of Gentrys in Tennessee, because of Robert and his son Gentry, and they had a lot of kids.
Awesome. All right. Well, thanks for coming on again. Really appreciate you. Hope to have you on again sometime, and good luck with your congressional race.
Yeah, thank you, and you're welcome to have me back on here. Great questions, and I appreciate strong questions and getting to the heart of the matter, and I think you guys do that, and I commend you on the work that you're doing, and you're welcome to have me back anytime. I would be grateful for it.
Awesome. You can handle it. Okay. Be well. I'm kind of blown away from that interview, as a matter of fact, but welcome to the Steve to Steve segment of our show, where we cover what we just heard. Producer Steve, what did you think of our guest, John Gentry?
Episode 127. It took that long, a needle in a haystack, to find an amazing man. 1,000-fold, 10,000-fold of John Gentry. We need this man. We need to take what he's taking and educate all of our people. Because I'm like, okay, does every state have similar written information in it? I bet it does. And it can be used. So we saw all these lawsuits during the COVID thing. Remember all the lawsuits that went out there, and they were using AGs and stuff, and the AGs sat on it. They didn't do nothing because they're corrupt to the core. And if we have an appeals, now of course in Washington State, they closed off the most states closed their House of Representatives or Congress. You couldn't even go in there. You couldn't
in the courthouses,
because they knew that I could come in there and I could complain, and they shut it down. That's how you knew that this was all corrupt. It had nothing to do with what they were telling us. And so I'm going to take John, I'm going to look at my Washington State Constitution. I'm going to look all these things up.
And they're usually 3-4 pages long. It's not like it's an encyclopedia. The case law as it is, but that's because they've packed it all in so you don't understand it. So there I was listening to Mill Creek View, Florida podcast on my daily Caroline the dog walk on maybe the most gorgeous day of the summer, at least so far. Very good show about the Supreme Court, by the way. And I heard you quote Proverbs during the Cat and Producer Steve segment in the litter box, she calls it. Proverbs 24, blessing the wicked and cursing the righteous. What did you mean by that?
That is dealing with the whole judiciary system. If you take that in context, Proverbs talks about judges, talks about rulers. And what it is that corrupt rulers bless the wicked and they curse the righteous. So there's also another passage that says, when the wicked rise to power, the righteous are cowering. When the righteous rise to power, the wicked cower. And so what happens is these are corrupt. It's saying when there's corrupt people in there, they cater to their own corrupt people.
Sounds familiar, right? Didn't we just have a whole show based on that?
Saying this is
so she interviewed a Epoch Times reporter, Matt Vadum. I interviewed an Epoch Times truthful reporter too, Jackson Elliott. They both play pretty well into John's topic of discussion, doesn't it? About First Amendment freedom of speech and to redress your government. We also had Simon Atiba from Africa Today and Monica Page from One American News. Both are White House correspondents.